Is there a theory of architecture? Is there a theory of architecture? A singular and universal theory that applies to everyone, to all civilizations and in all circumstances? Should there be one? If there can be one, what it may concern itself with? What may be its components? We have been theorizing about architecture ever since we became conscious about architecture as opposed to just a building, as a shelter. But we have not theorized about theory. In the absence of such an understanding, we often confront several misconceptions. For example, we sometimes hear an architect say, I do not follow a theory. I just build what I think is right. But even this is a statement of position, and therefore a theoretical codification of one's practices, and is motivated by one's desire to express something, though one may not be aware of that. Is architecture a product of each architect's subjective desire to express? If every architect thinks like that, we will have a situation of anything goes. But that does not happen, and there must be a regulating force. So let us see what we mean when we say theory. The word theory derives from the Greek theorein, and the term theoria, a noun, was already used by the scholars of ancient Greece, which means to look at, to contemplate, to divine or extract the essence of something. Interestingly, the Sanskrit translation for philosophy is darshana, which also means to see or to gain an insight. Thus, theory implies looking at a phenomenon or work from a critical distance to extract the underlying principles or meanings. That is what scientific theory does. It explains a phenomenon, a natural phenomenon, and predicts causality. But there is a crucial difference between science and architecture. Science deals with and explains nature, and therefore theory is universal and independent of history. Architecture, on the other hand, is a product of and expresses culture. And thus theory will have to be civilizational and historical. For cultures differ from civilization to civilization and evolve over time, and therefore a theory will have to be historically valid. There cannot be a singular universal theory. It interprets the phenomena of architecture from time to time and prescribes appropriate rules of action. Appropriate. Theory of architecture can at best be described as a coherent set of ideas that informs architecture from time to time and is specific and appropriate to the culture in which it is practiced. Appropriate implies certain relativity. A design decision may or may not be appropriate in all conditions. That sense of appropriateness provides the check against anything goes and the resultant visual chaos. In early pre-modern and pre-rational societies, it was the tradition or a prototype provided the rationale for a design decision. A prototype could be an earlier solution on which an agreement has been reached. This design of the Toda hut may have been arrived at after many, many years of experimentation. But once an agreement has been reached that this is the best way of building, it became both a prototype and also a tradition. It takes away the decision from the subjective realm. Similarly, the celebrated gate at Sanchi may have been a stylized version of an earlier gate built with wood and bamboo for an ancient village settlement. Common practices which are recognized as representing the best are celebrated and elevated as an archetype. Contrary to popular belief, design is always a rational act, a thoughtful organization of parts in an entity. The process involves a rational choice-making, a conscious synthesis of form, and a search for the logic that validates and authenticates a composition. No less rational is the ancient practice, still prevalent among some pre-rational societies, of arriving at an ordered form by following an archetype, an image that informs this choice-making. Humans have always marveled at the form of the human body as the quintessential representation of the cosmic order, and therefore a ready template for the temporal form. In these diagrams of houses of the Dogon tribes of West Africa, with an incredible design sense, as can be seen in this masks they make, the parts of the human body have been invested with meanings, which then are transferred onto the plans of their houses. Men occupy the positions of head, women that of the hands, the chest symbolizes the family. In another plan, cooking and store symbolize the head and the arms, indicating the significance accorded to nourishment. Perhaps the best example wherein the human body was stylized as a kind of a divine model, a spiritual matrix of meanings overlaid on the form of the human body, is this famous mandala, wherein the body is imagined as representing the entire cosmos. This in turn provides the logic and validation for the spatial arrangement of Hindu temple, signifying the meeting, the coming together of the divine and the earthly mundane universes. The temple as a representation of the cosmic architecture. This is achieved through the medium of the human body as the ultimate supreme archetype. It has informed and validated the spatial arrangement of this temple. The archetype of the mandala here is the theory. If the logic for taking appropriate design decision came from the archetype of the human body, it was a symbolic logic. The archetype conveyed the meanings through symbols which everyone comprehended. This happened in pre-rational societies, such as India and several other places. In Europe, during the Age of Reason, it took another form. The human body was the source of the formal logic as opposed to symbolic logic. It provided the theoretical basis for choosing the right number, measurement, and geometry. Interestingly, though the ancient Greeks had recognized geometry and number as the pure product of human mind, they never connected this with the human body. That development occurred during the 16th century Renaissance in Europe. Hence, the human body became the archetype of perfect dimensions and proportions. An archetype of appearances, of outward appearances rather than deep meanings. Le Corbusier in the 20th century constructed a whole theory based on human dimensions and proportions, and also connected the proportions of the human body with that of the nautilus shell to demonstrate that the proportions he was representing or presenting were truly universal and were obtainable throughout the nature. There is a very interesting and very consequential point here to be made. In saying that the dimensions and the proportions of the human body are also obtainable in the entire nature, the man of Renaissance explicitly separated human body and the mind and placed the body in the realm of nature as having universal attributes, including dimensions and proportions. On the other hand, in the realm of the mind, every individual is unique and distinct from the other. Remember Hannah Arendt in the last session, the speech and action? This notion that the dimensions and proportions of the human body are universal is the origin of the idea of an ideal human body. After all, not every one of us have the same body proportions. Thus, in all representations in paintings and sculptures, humans are always portrayed as with this ideal body. Like Michelangelo's David, a perfectly shaped man. It also gave birth to this notion that a beautiful woman is a perfectly shaped woman with outward appearances, the object of every man's desires. Here we see a major turning point in the journey to theory. This notion of the individual with a unique mind, independent of his body, is a product of the Renaissance and marks the end of the traditional era and the beginning of the modern period, when the individual is seen as responsible for his own actions and his designs, and not dependent upon traditions or established prototypes of archetypes, divine or otherwise. In other words, now we see architect as the author of his work with his own sense of what is appropriate. Theory now takes on a new meaning. This transition happened in the 18th century Europe and marks the end of the era when architecture was both informed and legitimized by the theoretical inputs from classical traditions, prototype or divine models. It is the beginning of the theory as we know it today, as a set of ideas that informs and legitimizes our design actions and choices. Of course, written theoretical treatises did exist earlier. We have already noted Vitruvius and Mayamatam. These theories are in the form of codifications of the best practices, the systematization of the accumulated knowledge of many generations. Theory from now on takes the form of the critical assessment of or interpretations, which can only be done by a rational mind interrogating an action or a phenomenon from a critical distance. But this transition from the traditional to the modern in Europe was not a smooth, gradual, normal, and organic, as most cultural transitions are. It was an intellectual and cultural revolution. It actually came to be known as the Cartesian Revolution and may be ascribed to one specific event and a few enlightened individuals with the radical ideas. The event I'm referring to is the discovery of telescope by Galileo Galilei in 1610. In the face of it, it seems innocuous enough. The invention of an optical instrument which allows us to see distant stars. But it caused a major paradigm shift, not only in our worldview, but also in our understanding of ourselves as humans and that of our relationship with nature. In order to grasp the real impact, we will have to step back a few years in history. As this cosmography, the map of the entire universe as was known then, shows, the Earth is at the center of the universe, with all the planets orbiting around it. What is drawn here corresponded with and confirmed what was obvious and self-evident to the human senses. The church supported this view, and thus it had become the accepted orthodoxy. It also established that what the senses tell us is truth, and that the senses are the true source of knowledge. But earlier, about half a century earlier, in 1543, Nicholas Copernicus, relying more on his calculations than on the visual evidence, had proposed that it is the sun that occupies the center and not the earth. However, as he was not able to furnish any tangible evidence, he was ignored and allowed to continue his studies. But now, Galileo provided the tangible evidence by observations through a scientific instrument. This had two major consequences. One, it liberated mankind from the earth-boundedness. If you are stuck on the surface of this earth by gravity, now we can fly with more than just our imagination and be close to the distant stars. The second consequence is a much graver one, was this question: can we really rely on the senses to give us true knowledge? What is the source of true knowledge? These questions were answered by the French philosopher René Descartes, acknowledged as the father of modern science and philosophy. He proclaimed that the senses are not reliable and that true knowledge can only be had through the mind by the exercise of the faculty of reason. In the process, he also conceived the duality of the humanness in separation of the mind and the body I referred to earlier. His book is aptly titled Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and of Seeking Truth in Sciences. Here, reason is tied with truth, and science is the only path for seeking truth. We all know that what followed came to be known as the Age of Reason. In fact, he proclaimed the very essence of humanity and connected it with thinking and reasoning. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. No wonder this revolution is known as the Cartesian Revolution. This huge cultural revolution essentially liberated all human knowledge from the metaphysical orthodoxy controlled by classical traditions and the church. The theoretical writings in philosophy, sciences, humanities, and arts all proliferated. But among all these creative developments, it is hard to miss a common narrative that runs across all disciplines. And that narrative goes something like this. Reality is measurable. Anything that cannot be measured or cannot be described in measurable terms is not real. Science and technology, which embody this measurable reality, are the guiding beacons of this age. Architecture too should be aligned with science and technology in this age of reason and industrialization. However, for architecture to catch up to this new worldview took more than 2 centuries, and the story of how that happened is worth narrating. It begins with Jean-Rodolphe Perronnet. He was a French architect in the middle of the 18th century. He was no ordinary architect the way we today understand the normal architects to be. Not only he designed villas and other public buildings, he also designed and built bridges and other civic structures. Here we see one of the bridges he designed with not only elaborate details of scaffolding, but also a crane he designed to transport large stones to the middle of the river and to put them in place. An enterprising English engineer recently built one to see if it works, and it did. Thus, he was not only a designer, but he also engineered his structure and built them as builder. Actually, that was the normal practice in those days. Architects were expected to undertake all tasks related to buildings. But Perronnet was especially good at this. And in 1747, he was asked by the emperor to train others into the art of building roads and bridges. And thus was born the School of Civil Engineering, École de Ponts et Chaussées. That was the birth of the profession of civil engineering. As the new profession grew, it led to questions about the respective roles of the architect and the engineers. If the engineers can claim specialized expertise in those areas of all building activities, not just roads and bridges, which demanded rigorous and measurable decision-making, what should be the attributes and responsibilities of the architect? Now we know that Vitruvius in the 1st century had defined 3 essential attributes for architecture: venustas, commoditas, and firmitas. That was the established theory of architecture. Architecture equals firmness, structural stability, functionality, and beauty. Now the engineering profession was claiming greater expertise in commoditas and firmitas. Architecture, for the first time in its history, suffered a crisis of identity. Thus, for example, in the 18th century, architecture was for the first time declared to be in a state of decadence. Dishonesty, confusion, and disintegration. In the 19th century, it was blamed for, and I quote, labor wasted, misplaced, and vulgarized, unquote. Is design a rational act, or does it deal with only taste, which is fleeting? These were the questions facing the profession of architecture. But there already existed an answer to this. As we saw in the last session, Alberti had proposed a duality of design and matter to define architecture. This was a substantial improvement over Vitruvius's triad of firmness, utility, and beauty. By calling design as a thoughtful act of the human mind and placing building, the matter, the materiality, in the realm of nature, Alberti had conceived architecture in the realm where man and nature came together in an act of cooperation, and any consideration of both beauty and rationalities were integral to this. Only a few years after Perronnet's School of Civil Engineering was established in Paris. Another Frenchman, this time a Jesuit priest, Marc-Antoine Logier, published a book on architecture in 1753. The chronology is important here. Before this, there existed only two theoretical treatises on architecture, that of Vitruvius and the one by Alberti. Now, I do not know why architects of the 18th century did not recollect Alberti to counter the questions about the rationality of architecture. In Alberti's duality of design and matter, proposed in this book, De Re Edificatoria, amounted to a powerful rationale for thinking about architecture as a holistic and integrated act, embracing both rational as well as irrational, not irrational. Architecture and engineering were inseparable. However, this relationship between architecture and engineering has been altered by curiously fiddling with the Vitruvian tripartite structure to align architecture with science and technology. During the next 2 centuries, architecture went through several different identities. This enterprise was aided by a series of theoretical postulations about the nature of architecture. In all throughout, the architectural production on one side and the production of the ideas in architecture, the theoretical enterprise, went step by step together. During all this time, production of ideas, that is theoretical production, and the production of built spaces, architecture, have marched side by side, feeding on each other. Logier's book was one of the first such instances. This is made clear by this illustration in the very beginning. It shows a mature lady pointing a finger to a seemingly natural formation, which looks like a primitive hut. This is a powerful visual metaphor and a justification for the new rational architecture. In Logier's own words, this is how it describes: all the splendors of architecture ever conceived have been modeled on this little rustic hut I have just described. It is by approaching the simplicity of this first model that fundamental mistakes are avoided and true perfection is achieved. The pieces of wood set upright have given us the idea of the column. The pieces placed horizontally on top of them, the idea of entablature. The inclining pieces forming the roof, the idea of the pediment. This is what all masters of art have recognized. But take note of this. Never has a principle been made more fertile in its effect. From now on, it is easy to distinguish between the parts which are essential to the composition of an architectural order and those which have been introduced by necessity or have been added by caprice. The parts that are essential are the cause of beauty. The parts introduced by necessity cause every license. The parts added by caprice cause every fault. What is being attempted here is nothing short of the creation of a new archetype, replacing the human body as the earlier divine model. All the symbolism here, the mature lady as the muse of architecture, sitting on what looks like broken pieces of classical architecture, and the infant representing the architect, his infancy symbolizing the dawn of his consciousness. And finally, the primordial forest. All this telling us that rationalism itself was still in the state of infancy when it still needed a divine model or divine authentication. But it was on its way. Vitruvius's equation has been now reformulated to suit the times, to align architecture with new rationalism. It tells you that if your buildings are functional and stable, they are going to be beautiful. This was the first such reformulation. There were others to follow, as we shall see. Now, here is an illustration I like. It was drawn by architect illustrator César Dali, who was the secretary of the prestigious French Academy of Architecture, and who also published an equally prestigious journal on architecture. His views, therefore, carry weight. Here, the metaphor of the rustic hut is replaced by a steam engine, which had by now become the quintessential icon of the industrial age. Here, the muse is riding the engine named Progress towards the new dawn. The three wheels of the engine are beauty, stability, and utility of the Vitruvian frame. Following the engine is a procession, which on the way is destroying the past, the old and the very old architecture. Besides the engine is a graveyard of all the historical styles of architecture. The procession is moving towards the rising sun, the symbol of reason and rationalism. Rationalism was now well entrenched, a theoretical movement in architecture. Theoretical enterprise from now on becomes an exercise in re-looking and interpreting the past architectural practices from rationalist lenses and finding new meanings in the historical buildings. These new interpretations will both inform and authenticate new architecture. At the same time, Industrial Revolution had thrown up new materials such as steel and reinforced concrete, which also opened up new possibilities. For example, here the French architect Viollet-le-Duc takes a retrospective look at the existing architectural vocabulary, but with a rational perspective. He calls his book Dictionnaire raisonné, the rational vocabulary. With beautiful and meticulously drawn drawings, Le-Duc conveys that architecture is a rational resolution of the forces acting on the building. He has skillfully combined the ancient knowledge of masonry construction with the new material, cast iron, to highlight the aesthetic contribution of technology. Another Frenchman, Auguste Choisy, a few years younger than Le-Duc, was an architectural historian. After extensive travels, he wrote this 2-volume book on the history in which he literally rewrote the history of architecture, analyzing the historical buildings in social and technological terms. He used innovative drawings to represent buildings in their most essential aspects. For example, the sketches of the buttresses of a cathedral are shown in their most essential abstractness. They tell us that far from any consideration of beauty, or maybe before any consideration of beauty, the forms of these elements are determined by their technological necessity. For both Le-Duc and Choisy, commoditas, that is necessity, firmitas, that is stability, two of the three attributes of architecture in the Vitruvian triad in the domain of the rational are collapsed in a singular as stability. And the Vitruvian formula gets restated again as architectural beauty equals stability. The light-filled airiness of this large reading room in the National Library of Paris by architect Henri Labrouste has been achieved by cast iron construction. Such lightness and the spatial expanse would be unimaginable in the traditional masonry construction. This quality of architecture here is made possible only by the imaginative use of technology. Technology then is the determinant of architecture. The theoretical postulates of Viollet-le-Duc and Auguste Choisy both informed and found expression in this work of Labrouste. Julien Guadet was a pupil of Henri Labrouste. He is known more for his contribution to architectural theory by this book of his, Elements and Theories of Architecture. It is a comprehensive study of building types from many periods in history. To that extent, it's a new theoretical postulation. He introduced the idea of content of a building, that is the utilitarian purpose or function from which one would arrive at the design of the container of that content, the building. He also advocated that the material and technology they engender be the expressive elements in architecture. This was beautifully demonstrated in this apartment building by his student, Auguste Perret. This is the first apartment building in Paris, which not only uses the reinforced concrete frame with non-load-bearing walls, but also expresses the skeleton skillfully in its front facade. The plan with non-structural walls anticipates Le Corbusier's free plan. In Perret's own words, one must never allow into a building any element destined solely for ornament, but rather turn to ornament all the parts necessary for its support. Construction is the architect's mother tongue. The architect is a poet who thinks and speaks in construction. There is a direct connection here between technology and beauty. According to this theory, technology is the determinant of architectural beauty. With this, architecture has come very close in fulfilling its destiny to align itself with science and technology in this age of reason and industrialization. The next reformulation of the architectural triad happened when Louis Sullivan across the Atlantic in America proclaimed form follows function. In other words, read together with Auguste Perret's statement above, the self-identity of architecture has oscillated between technology and functional efficiency. Both children of rationalism as the determinants of architectural beauty in the ongoing attempts to align architecture with science and technology. The final act to align with science and technology, not only architecture, but all arts and everyday functions, was the establishment of Bauhaus, the design school in Germany in 1919. It attempted to unify the principles of mass production with individual artistic vision and strove to combine aesthetics with everyday functions. The staff at Bauhaus was also seized by the revolutionary possibilities of industrialization, as can be seen in this statement. Oskar Schlemmer, one of the founders of the Bauhaus, wrote in the school's manifesto. Reason and science, man's greatest powers are the regions, and the engineer is the sedate executor of unlimited possibilities. Mathematics, structure, and mechanization are the elements, and power and money are the dictators of this modern phenomenon of steel, concrete, glass, and electricity, quote unquote. This has had a profound impact on architecture in large part of the 20th century. Logier's dream of an architectural order made up only of the most essential and necessary parts was realized when Mies van der Rohe proclaimed, "Less is more." It was 200 years since Logier wrote his book, and 400 years since Galileo invented telescope. He was, after all, the root cause of all of this. During this time, both architecture and the ideas that have shaped architecture have emerged side by side, feeding on each other. Great architecture was produced, but it has not been without a price. Looking back, we now realize that there have been two not so desirable consequences that have resulted from this. One, believing that modernism can be achieved only by leaving our past behind has alienated us from our history. History not in knowing what happened when, but in recognizing the meanings our ancestors have embedded in the forms they have created. And two, our obsession with the abstract in modern architecture, in our ongoing attempt to be like science and technology, has deprived us of a sense of place. It is in the nature of abstract to be alienated from its context. That is the very essence of abstractness. Context, not only as the physical surrounding, but, and far more so, the social and cultural milieu in which great architecture is always rooted. Both these issues are being addressed at present by great minds in our profession. But it will take another occasion for us to take this up. Right now, I want to end this with this conclusion. There is no single and universal theory of architecture. In architecture, as in all cultural activities, theory and practice have a reciprocal relationship. They mirror each other. Theory is born out of the practice, and practice in turn is informed and authenticated by the theory. Architecture is a cultural construct. The purpose of a theory is to understand the relationship between the formal decisions and the prevailing cultural norms. you.